Hey, RC.
Hey, how's it going, Aaron?
I'm good. Maybe let's talk just very briefly about two great surf sessions in the last week. You were out on, it was, I believe, Sunday, and I was out Monday morning.
Correct.
Yours was big and great. Mine was small and pretty great.
So both great.
But we're getting off topic.
Yes, true.
Today on the show, we have Annick MacAskill. Annick is a writer and the author of 4 full-length poetry collections, including Murmurations, No Meeting Without Body, which was nominated for the League of Canadian Poets Gerald Lampert Memorial Award, and shortlisted for the J.M. Abraham Poetry Award at the Atlantic Book Awards. Her third collection, Shadow Blight, came out in 2022 and won the Governor-General's Literary Award for English language poetry. MacAskill's fourth book of poetry, Votive, was published in the fall of 2024, and like the rest of her books, it was published by Gaspereau Press.
And I really enjoyed reading Votive. So let's welcome to the show Annick MacAskill.
Of toast and a hard-boiled egg and 2.5 coffees.
Oh man, that's the poet's breakfast.
Pretty much.
Okay. Welcome, Annick, to the King's Further Reading Podcast. How you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good. I just wanted to start off by asking, your poems draw from things that are both a little bit more difficult to access, mythology, things of that nature, and then there's stuff like Freddie Prinze Jr. and other things like that. And I'm wondering, do you see, like, will you write something and say, oh, maybe that's too inaccessible, or maybe that's a little bit too low-hanging fruit?
No, never. I really, when I'm writing, I write primarily for myself, and I try not to think about things like that. And when it comes to editing, you know, maybe some of that would creep in, but by and large, at this point, it's so corny, but the advice I give to younger poets or emerging poets is to just write the book that only you could write. And so I like to write with my references. And part of what's going on there, I think, is that I don't think of cultural references as, you know, some are so recherché and elite, or some are so lowbrow and too accessible or whatever. I don't think of it that way. It's all just the world to me. And so that's about bringing in the world.
Yeah. And related to that, being a poet, I see it as a form where you're kind of very free to do as you please, less so than, say, like Ryan and I are more familiar with nonfiction. And I feel like there's such a market angle to all that, anything nonfiction. Would you say that's true?
I actually do think that's true. I think that's very interesting, and I think there's definitely something to that. I think that poetry, there is that, once you kind of, you know, maybe after a few years, maybe at the beginning, I don't know, folks are looking to be Rupi Kaur or whatever, which fair enough. It's good to have ambitions, but yeah, it's such a different level of material, commercial, traditional forms of success that you can access with something like poetry. And so I do think that a lot of poets let go of that stuff faster than other writers, although I think there's also just a lesson in there about, kind of like the bad news, good news of things these days is that I would say in something like Canadian publishing and, you know, being a writer in Canada, like things are a bit tough and for all genres, honestly. And I think that, in terms of incomes, like writers are not making the kinds of money that they used to. And I really appreciate it when older established writers talk about this, for example, when they talk about the difference in their like access copyright checks that they got maybe 20 years ago versus now, royalties and, the money behind publishing houses to promote a book, things like that, reviewing spaces. And so I think, I feel almost spoiled as a poet because if you can let go of that stuff, then you can just focus on the writing and the art. And but yeah, there's definitely a kind of liberty. Like my poet friends and I will joke about being in, if you're in Banff and you're with a bunch of poets but also with a bunch of prose writers, like all the nonfiction and fiction writers are talking about their agents and all the poets are talking about like, what is a feeling? And, like.
Which seems like more fun.
definitely.
And
Definitely.
I think related to this collection, I had a question about the title of the collection, Votive. I looked the word up. I had a sense of it, but I had almost forgotten that it was an adjective. I'm just curious to know where you came up with that as your title. Was it early on, or was it later after you'd written your poems?
Yeah, this collection is a collection in the sense of a gathering of poems. So I didn't, my last two collections of poetry were very much themed. And this was so kind of, conceived as a whole more or less from the outset. And this is a gathering of poems that I wrote over the past 10 years, roughly. Some of the poems actually predate my first collection, which is just, publishing is funny that way sometimes. And so at one point, maybe about 2-3 years ago, I started gathering these specific poems. And I had to then think about what unified them because there's not a very obvious cohesive theme, I don't think. But for me, a lot of this was about devotion.
Yeah.
And so I thought about the image of the votive candle, which is present in, a lot of different Christian churches, including the Catholic churches that I saw as growing up and continue to visit sometimes. And then also, just the sense of like votive as in a prayer or a wish, something desired, and votive devotion, having that kind of common etymology there as well to bring it together.
And I see 3 poems through the collection with the same title, Votive. And it's not Votive 1, 2, and 3. That's a deliberate choice. I'm just curious where you came up with that. And is 3 a significant number as well?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I didn't think about it. Now I'm thinking of the Holy Trinity, of course. Yeah. But that's pretty obvious. But I honestly hadn't thought about that. Well, votive, I wrote one poem. The first votive I wrote, it kind of just flew out of me. And I was pretty happy with it. And then I was looking at the collection, and I had section breaks, which I typically have in my books. But I thought, maybe in lieu of formal section breaks, I would have these 3 votive sonnets to orient the collection and kind of as place markers in the collection. And I can't remember the order with the other 2 and what order I wrote them. But those came not long after. And I think, there's something like this was a gathering of poems. So a lot of these poems I just wrote as individual poems, not with an eye towards a collection. But some of them, did come later when I was in the organizational phase. And I think once you start thinking about organizing, your subconscious starts to help you out a little bit and come up with material that can, tie things together.
Yeah.
You started with the themed collections. This one less so. Are you more attracted to when you're reading other poets' work? Like, does a theme sort of put you somewhere right away that makes you feel comfortable, or like you know where you're going, kind of thing?
As a reader, I kind of like it all. I read a lot of poetry. I'm a person who just digs stuff, and
Cool.
and I don't, I enjoy reading poetry that's very, very different than my poetry, and I think that's cool. And so, but I do quite enjoy, I do enjoy an unthemed collection. And the one thing I will say is I do think that there's a tendency maybe over the past 5-10 years towards themed collections, collections with some sort of narrative arc or very definable subject matter. And, there's obviously nothing wrong with that. And I wrote a couple of those myself, but I like the space for just the gathering of poems. And I mean, one model I definitely had in the back of my head for my first book, and then maybe that persists a little, is that I have a background in Renaissance French poetry, and a lot of books from the Renaissance, especially early on in a poet's career, they would just be, again, like a gathering. There would be some political poems, some love poems, some nature poems, some spiritual poems, and some translations, and you would just gather it all together. And so I like that sort of like miscellany feel to a book as well.
And in this gathering of poems, there are a multitude of forms, which I really enjoy, but they all seem to have structure to them. So, like the one I'm thinking of is the mirror. The mirror is right justified and left justified, and it's kind of mirroring each other in the middle.
Yes.
And there are you use different spacings in the sonnets. You mentioned some sonnets you split after the 8th line, some you don't. The votives you keep all together. So does that reflect your desire to show diversity in your collection of poems?
Yeah, that's interesting. Probably. I hadn't really thought about it that way in terms of this book, but there is something, about variety, and I do like formal variety as a poet. And there again, it wasn't so intentional from the outset, but there's definitely more use of traditional form in this book than in my other books. It's not all the way across. And the poem you're referencing, Lesbos, that's not a traditional form at all. But that was, more a formal experimentation. But, the sonnet is something I gravitate towards very naturally. And I use, generally when I think sonnet, I use it in a very loose, baggy sense. So I like to think of the sonnet kind of a 14-line poem that, allows a thinking through. So this is kind of a very loose, modern definition of a sonnet. But there is one traditionally rhymed sonnet in there, knitting, and then a few of the sonnets will end with rhyming couplets, which was my sort of gesture towards the definitely the English language Shakespearean tradition of the rhyming couplet, although it's present in other languages as well, notably in French before Shakespeare. So, these things were in the back of my mind, and sometimes form is really helpful in a way that I think maybe we don't always acknowledge, where, for example, I have a villanelle in there, Penelope Shroud, and the villanelle is actually a very tricky form. Unlike my baggy sonnets, it's kind of tricky. So I think this was my first successful villanelle. If I deem it successful, at least. But
it is.
Thanks. And it was really hard. But there's something about, I actually wrote that at the Elizabeth Bishop House, and I kind of maybe, subconsciously as an homage to her. But I wrote it, and choosing the form, the words come because you've given yourself a container and a constraint. Totally. So actually the subconscious is activated in a way that I think we might not associate with traditional formal poetry, but yeah. And then things like, the glosas, there's glosas in the book, which is a form that dates back to 15th century Spain. And that's the one where you have 4 lines borrowed from another poet at the beginning as an epigraph and then repeating throughout the poem.
Was that the Plath one?
Yeah, there's one with Plath, there's 2 with Karen Soley, and there's one with Louisa Glick. Right. And I love that form, but it's that you kind of can't force. It either is working or it's not. And I think I wrote those 4 maybe in about a span of a month a couple years ago, and then, touched them up, whatever, ever since. But that's a form that I really enjoy. I have one gloss in my first book, but it's a bit looser. So this book did give me the occasion to work a bit more with form than I have before, for sure. Traditional form.
Do you find that has a poem ever sort of spilled out into a into a story?
Oh, into a story, like a short story?
You started and then actually, 2,000 words later, you're...
No. I do write short fiction, but...
Yeah. But that starts with the intention of it being short fiction. It never...
I suppose, yeah. It feels like a very different mode.
Yeah.
It feels like a very different mode.
Yeah.
Poetry feels easier to me at this point. But
yeah. Do you want to talk about what's happening with short fiction for you?
Well, I write it sometimes.
Yeah.
I like short fiction. I don't know about you two, but I write some fiction, and I've written longer form as fiction as well, but less successfully probably. I like short stories. There's something in there I think that is shared with poems, especially short stories. So getting towards the 2,000, 3,000 word count, which is actually really difficult. But there's something there, if you can kind of distill things, you can build towards an ending in a way that feels a bit like the way a lot of poems move, right? With this kind of resonant or meaningful epiphany or turn at the end of a poem. Right. I think similarly you can work towards that in fiction and in short fiction in particular. And the other thing about short fiction, I suppose, is, you can really focus on the level of the line if it's just a few thousand words, whereas I think that would be obviously harder to sustain in a novel. Not that novelists don't do that, of course, but yeah, I definitely... So I write some short fiction here and there. I've had a few short stories published. I had a short story longlisted for the CBC Prize this year. And
nice.
Yeah. And then it's something I'm kind of... It feels a bit like working on this book of poetry. I am first of all, just trying to work on each individual story and make sure they're decent, but hopefully leading towards a collection at some point.
And do you ever think about writing a novel?
I wrote one novel,
Okay.
and I don't like it anymore.
I'm glad to hear it. Okay, yeah.
I don't like it anymore, but it was a good exercise,
Yeah.
and then I'm working on another novel.
Did you submit it anywhere?
No.
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 How old were you when you did it?
Well, just 2020, 2021, so a few years ago.
Oh,
Just a
okay.
few years ago.
Okay.
And I mean, I also wrote,
It
all
wasn't an undergrad attempt. You
No.
were 19 and
no, I was too busy as an undergrad to
Okay.
write
yeah.
creatively. But
Yeah.
no, when I was a child, I think when I was 13, I wrote maybe 40 pages of something I was hoping would become a novel. And then
Cool.
in my late 20s, I also wrote maybe 100 pages. And then, but those were uncompleted, obviously. And then I completed one bad novel, but it was a good exercise just to complete it.
I think it's a perfect time to talk about Sinead O'Connor. But
When is it not a good time to talk about Sinead O'Connor?
I really like that poem.
Thank you.
And your recollection of seeing her on Saturday Night Live. What does she mean to you, and why did you go through that process of checking to see what type of Catholic you were so often on that website? Yeah.
When I was a child, well, because I was a confused child, and I wrote that poem, Sinead O'Connor, Catholic, the day she died, or the day I learned she died. So maybe that was the day after she died. But it came out of me quite quickly, and it was based on a couple of childhood memories. And one was that I used to haunt this website that still exists, although I couldn't find the test when I looked for the quiz. When I looked for it, what kind of Catholic are you?
Mm-hmm.
This is a tongue-in-cheek thing. It's not like sanctioned by the Catholic
Oh,
Church.
no, absolutely not. This is a website called beliefnet.com or maybe just belief.net. I can't remember. It definitely exists. It has not, like, the Catholic Church does not run it, to my knowledge. And it's just it was a lot of information about spirituality and different religious traditions, and that was something I was very interested in, as like a preteen, teen. And then I was, I didn't see Sinead O'Connor live on SNL. I later found, and I read about this in the poem, like I found the clips on YouTube.
Right.
And to me, I think, so from a very early age, she represented a woman, a feminist woman, later, realizing a queer woman who kind of shook the walls within the Catholic Church and, had this pull towards Catholicism. And I should say, she didn't enter her life a Catholic. But, this pull towards devotion, which is something that preoccupied me in a lot of these poems, a pull towards the form of devotion that is your cultural inheritance, Roman Catholicism, for Sinead O'Connor, for me as well. But then feeling, of course, a lot of anger and frustration and sadness about homophobia and sexism within the Catholic Church.
You were raised Catholic?
Not really. Everyone in my family is Catholic, but my parents weren't very religious. I did accompany extended family to church many, many times, and it was kind of in the background of my life. And then I think as a teenager, I kind of went searching and felt this pull again towards Catholicism while having a lot of issues with it, and feeling kind of like that to this day. And I won't give money to the Catholic Church for political reasons, for a lot of reasons. But I'm very interested, and one of the nice things actually about my studies was that I ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on a nun from the 16th century. So it gave me kind of like an exterior academic research-based focus that allowed me to interact with a tradition without feeling, like I just don't think I could. I know I couldn't go regularly to a Catholic church and feel comfortable as me. And again, I also don't want to give them my money, quite frankly. But, engaging with the history and the iconography and the texts and the tradition, I was able to find that balance kind of bizarrely in my research for a while. And
And there's so many vivid scenes in your collection. And especially two lines stick out to me when you say, I saw the light. And then the next line, you say you felt the heat. And I love the way you put that. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I appreciate that those lines stood out to you. That's in the first votive. But I saw the light and then was swallowed by its heat. Great is the molten sea that rushed beneath my feet. And I think that is just the tension of, seeing the light, seeing the appeal, the warmth of spirituality, and then also what's implied in certain traditions is, you know, like the guilt and the shame, the sexual shame that you can't escape if you're going to, you know, live within, adhere to, respect that tradition.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's, yeah. We talked a couple weeks ago, this is kind of switching gears, we talked about podcasts.
Yes. Yeah. Uh-oh.
And
that was off the record. That was as friends.
Well, I guess, yeah, sorry, but I guess I wanted to add to it because I thought about it for a long time. And basically what you said, correct me if I'm wrong, was like, you're like, oh, I actually kind of like listening to sort of like rocky podcasts where the host isn't very professional and the guests are, you know, wing nuts or whatever. And can you, first of all, can you expand on that a little?
Well, you know, there's, I think, a few things going on there. One is that definitely if it's about poetry, so I think I might have told you, Aaron, that I don't listen to a ton of podcasts unless they're about Canadian poetry or historically personal finance.
How many are there? Personal finance.
And I've exhausted personal finance because it can only be, there's only so much to learn, to be honest.
Yeah.
But it's something about people. I'm a Taurus, so I think hearing people talk about money is like bizarrely interesting to me. But poetry, yeah, I'll listen to anyone's poetry podcast, basically. Like, I just want, that's how much I love poetry. I want to hear poets talk.
Oh, good for you. That's good citizenship.
And coming at this from a publishing angle, and this beautiful collection is published by Gaspereau Press.
Yes.
Currently Nova Scotian, pretty soon to be based in New Brunswick.
Correct, yeah.
How has it been working with Gaspereau, and why do you think, or what do you think about Gaspereau?
Oh, it's been a dream. It's been wonderful, honestly. And it's definitely one of those things, you don't know what you got till it's gone. When I heard the announcement this year, I did feel a bit crestfallen. One of the things maybe I'll say is that, you know, we all know the stuff, like they're beautiful books, beautifully made. They wear really well. You're going to find out, you know, like they just, over time, they're so supple, they're so easy to open, but you're not cracking the spine. It's kind of just this incredible design, beautiful aesthetic. But I submitted to Gaspereau in 2017, and they didn't know me from Adam. They had no idea who I was. I was living in Kitchener, Ontario. I'd never met Andrew Steeves or Gary Dunfield of Gaspereau Press. And Andrew Steeves reads all submissions. He's a person who actually reads the slush pile and gets to every submission and responds to every submission. And I got very lucky, and he took my manuscript. And I had submitted to Gaspereau because I loved the poetry they published, so more than the aesthetic of the book, although I certainly appreciate that so much. For me, it was just about the quality of the poetry. And this is, you know, I give this advice to emerging poets all the time. When you're deciding who to submit to, look at your bookshelf, go to the bookstore, go to the library, who is publishing the poetry you like and respect.
Right.
I mean, I think it's the same with all writers. You know, it's like, if you look at the past 2 years of a press, do you actually like and respect and have something in common with what they're publishing? Well, then submit to them. And so that's what I did. It was that simple. And I didn't expect them to take my manuscript. I felt like I'm, you know, ticking a box, and I'll go through a list, and I'll start here. And they were at the top of my list, and I'll submit to them, but they'll probably reject me, and that's fine. I'm just, you know, I'm paying my dues. I'm going through the steps. But I was very fortunate that Andrew responded to my manuscript.
Nice.
Yeah.
Did you get any rejections before they accepted it?
From
or simultaneous, say? Did you submit to a few at the same time?
I wasn't doing simultaneous submissions. I think, I wonder what it's like for nonfiction. I think that's opened up a bit over the past few years. Publishers and journals are more open to simultaneous submissions, but at the time it was a bit, it wasn't really something that you did. So it was, I submitted it to Gaspereau, and I waited 5 months, which is not a very long time, but a bit of time, and then I got my answer.
That's great. And you've been with them for the last, how many books?
All of my books. So this is my 4th book with Gaspereau, my 4th book. And very fortunate as well to have Andrew as an editor. I think he's been a great editor for me, very open-minded, very encouraging, but has that keen editorial eye that you want, especially with something like poetry. He's a really fine poet in his own right. And I feel like maybe that's something that people don't know, because he has been so much more productive as a publisher, but he has published some poetry, and his poems are really beautiful. So he's a great writer, and he's a keen reader, and I've been lucky to work with him, and I'm sad.
Yeah.
I'm sad that it's ending.
Yeah, although Keegan Hawthorne, who's taking it over, will.
Oh, absolutely.
I couldn't think of a better fit.
And Andrew also has, Gary is retiring, which is great. I think people should be allowed to retire when they want to retire. And but Andrew's going to keep working. Andrew's going to have, his own production going under a new name, as far as I understand it. Don't know what it is, but I think more details of that are coming. Yeah.
Oh, I was gonna start the process of asking origins for you. First interested in writing.
Oh yeah. Well. I always love to read, so I guess there's that. Reading starts, and then also the first poem in this collection, Journal Intime, I wrote about a memory I have of when I was in elementary school and we had our classroom diaries. Did you two have these classroom diaries?
To some extent, but not as much as I got from your poem. It seems to be a more important central thing happening in your class.
Yeah.
Well, when I was quite young, like grade 1 or 2, here's what I did today. Is that what you mean, or this was an older that you were?
This was starting, as I read in the poem, as early as grade 2, but all the way through my elementary school in both English and French. So grade 2 through grade 8, we would have these classroom diaries, and I think it was a real trend in education at the time. This was how they were teaching composition, was that you would have a little notebook. I think it often just stayed in the classroom, and then you might have a prompt, what's your favorite meal or whatever, but then sometimes no prompt at all, and I'm very literal minded, and I would just treat it like a personal diary and write whatever I wanted in it, and then your teacher would take it and read it and mark it, which in retrospect seems really bizarre. But it did make me love, there was probably my earliest writing, also things, I remember we did like a collective Halloween story. So I just always loved it. So I am grateful to my teachers for nurturing that love of reading and then writing. And then poetry specifically, I have a distinct memory where when I was 8 or 9, my mother gave me a notebook and she wrote inside, "For more of your beautiful poems." And I don't think I had thought of what I was doing as poetry, but I was writing broken lines, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that was encouraging, obviously, as well.
Yeah. And then moving forward through high school or university?
I wrote a lot of poetry in high school. In high school, I found my mother's copy of Poets of Contemporary Canada, 1960 to 1970, which was an anthology edited by Eli Mandel, with, like Gwendolyn McEwen, Margaret Atwood, Irving Layton, Michael Ondaatje, those folks. And then I found Evelyn Lau at the public library. When my friends and I were checking out a bunch of romance novels, I found Evelyn Lau. And Evelyn Lau just really blew my mind. And so I had Poets of Contemporary Canada, but 1960 and 1970, so from before my birth. Yeah. And then at the library around the age of 15 or 16, finding Evelyn Lau, who was actually contemporary, like publishing in the 90s and early 2000s, and a young woman when she started publishing.
Is she Canadian?
She's Canadian. She's based in Vancouver, and she's incredible. And she's a poet. I will always think of her as a poet first, but she came to some prominence, notoriety for a memoir she wrote about being a teenage runaway. And it was turned into a TV movie with, I think, Sandra Oh. But one of her early collections, I think it was Oedipal Dreams, was up for the GG when she was maybe still a teenager, maybe in her early 20s. And so she just, what a role model, like a young woman, and really saying a lot of says, telling a lot of truths in her poems, really quite bold. And so she was, that had a big influence on me. And then I went to university and I stopped writing for almost a decade because I was too busy being serious. And
okay.
I was like a very serious student. And so I thought it was unserious to write one's own poetry, or that it was somehow incompatible with what I was doing. But then.
When did the door open again?
I was living in Paris and reading a bunch of 16th century French poets, and ironically thinking of them with less of an academic lens and more of a personal lens, and even relating to, they just wanted to make something beautiful and, write poetry. And I can relate to that. So I started taking my own poetry more seriously.
Do you think it helped being away from from Canada, from familiarity?
Probably. I didn't think about that. But yeah, probably. That might have been a bit liberating.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What was that living situation for you in Paris?
Oh, well, I was in my PhD, and I was doing research at the BNF and taking a seminar on Neo-Latin poetry. And so, yeah, just 6 months in Paris, living in the Canadian house at the International Residency.
This is for academics? This
was for
house?
academics.
Okay, of all disciplines?
So the Canadian house was just I can't find the word. It's like they call it the Cité Internationale, so it's like the international city, literally. But like, it's just a collection of
an Olympic village for
basically
academics.
For grad students, mostly.
Okay, yeah.
So I was in the Canadian house, in a very tiny room. I would hit my head on the ceiling every time I went to the bathroom for like the first month I lived there. But living in a very tiny room, but I did have a view of the Eiffel Tower from my window, so it was pretty special if I knelt on my bed. And I just going to the library and doing research on my nun and other 16th century French poets and auditing a Neo-Latin seminar.
Sounds wonderful.
I mean, yeah. It was, you know what? It was so funny. I had like bronchitis the first month I was there. It was January and like it snowed 1 inch in Paris. So the city shut down. So it was a bit like, it was actually sometimes a bit wild and rocky. But yeah, overall, I mean, very fortunate to have had that kind of time in Paris. And,
I have an editing question because Aaron and I working mostly in nonfiction and long form stuff. Editing probably looks a lot different than editing editorial advice or commentary in poetry. So what are you looking for when you ask for something to be edited?
That's a good question. Honestly, just if someone even likes it at all, if someone can honestly tell me if they think it's decent at all, because sometimes you can really lose sight of your own work. And I mean, the only other option is literally to wait like a year or two to look at a poem and decide if you actually think it's good, because you need a lot of distance. And so, you know, in the meantime, it's nice to have other readers who can say, well, this is maybe not your strongest work, or this is very promising, or whatever. And then, yeah, it can get all the way down to the very finicky line edits. And I have, you know, I have friends like Jamie Forsyth, who's a poet here in Halifax, who gave me a lot of great feedback on this work. Alison Smith, who's a poet in New Germany here, who was a great reader. My buddy John Nyman, who lives in Toronto, who's been a reader for all of my books and just a wonderful feedback machine. And like I said, Andrew is very, you know, it's nice to finish with Andrew. Like Andrew will not, there were some agricultural terms that had to be corrected in my first collection, and Andrew was perfect for that. But he just like that, you know, very attentive to detail, to phrasing, my own ear, time. It gets easier as time goes on, you know. And I read a lot of poetry and I edit other people's poetry, and that helps when you come back to your own poetry as well.
I think we're probably just about maxed out on time, but something that we ask everybody who comes in is, do you have any writing advice for people listening to this podcast?
Well, I'm trying to think of something original to say.
Because you gave some advice earlier to poets. You were mentioning, you know, write
for yourself. Yeah, write for yourself. I mean, again, on the question of like, you know, feeling free in poetry as opposed to other genres, you know, what is the point? Why are you trying to imitate a style just to imitate, or just, you know, like, of course there's like waves in poetry. The poetry that's most popular these days does not look like the poetry that was most popular when I started writing. When I started taking my writing more seriously, just over a decade ago, there was a lot of this like mean-spirited, catty, urbane, cool, super cool, aloof voice coming out of Toronto, and I thought I had to write like that.
In poetry?
In poetry. In poetry. And I thought I had to write like that. Like I thought I had to, my friend John Nyman, I think once described as like, there's just like a coolness, right? Like, and I mean both cool as in cold and cool as in like hip. And I thought I had to write like that. And then, you know, over time you shake that off. And definitely with poetry, but I would say even with all art, it's like, you want to say something. I think the more I move along, the more I just want to say something. And poetry is maybe a bit tricky in that way because there's a lot of potential for beautiful, ornate, interesting language, experimentation with form, and you can really push it without saying anything of substance.
Right.
So what do you want to say? What do you want to say? You know, to me, and there are some poets who don't really care what they want to say. They're doing something else with language, and that's cool too. But like, I mean, that's saying something. But I think often it's like, you know, a bit get to the point. Not that your poetry has to be transparent or anything like that, but like, think about what you really want to say and what you have to contribute to the conversation. Pay attention. Like, poetry to me is about paying attention to the world. You know, go on a walk and really think about it.
For sure.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yes, that's great.
Well, thank you so much, Annick, for
Thanks so
coming
much for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, right on. Further Reading is produced by the University of King's College MFA program, overseen by the great Gillian Turnbull. I edit it, Aaron Williams, that's me. Music is by Pete Johnson. Graphics are by Mike Smith. On the other side of the room from me is
R.C. Shaw over here.
Thanks a lot. We'll talk again soon.